Oh, goody.
Alright, what is up everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Mercenaries video. This one is going to be covering a new tier list for all the Mercenaries. This is going to be as of patch 22.6, the update that gave us Leeroy Jenkins, as well as a bunch of new dragons, Drekthar and Vandar. So we're going to be doing it a little bit differently this time. Wanted to try and make this a bit shorter and whatnot. So instead of going through all the mercs and actively building the tier list, I already put the tier list together. I'm just going to explain a bit of my reasoning for some of the characters. I'm mainly going to focus on the characters in S through C tier. We do have D and F tier down here, which I will, I guess, talk about very briefly, but I'm not going to go into all the characters a lot because truthfully there's really not whole lot to say about them. So we are going to focus on the higher tiered characters here. S tier, there's really not too much that has changed here. I did add A and A plus. That was kind of a suggestion I got in the last video because I did have a lot of characters in A. I thought, there are a lot of characters I do consider A tier, but I thought this was a good way to differentiate between them in terms of like the best of the best and the ones that are also still very good and prominent. So yeah, that's kind of the structure. Another different thing about this one is I did actually put them in a deliberate order, at least for S through C tier. So from left to right and then top to bottom, those are the order of, what I think are the best characters, rather than last time where it was kind of random. So we're going to dive right into it. Before we do though, if you enjoy this type of content, do remember to like and subscribe. Does a ton to help out the channel and keeps the Mercs videos coming. So let's dive right into it. Like I said, S tier, not a whole lot has changed here. Valeera is doing her thing, and unsurprisingly, that thing is still really good. I'll zoom in just a little bit here. Make it, yeah, that's a bit better. Blow it up for everybody a little bit. So Valeera is still just influencing the game like crazy. She is still the best character in the game in my opinion, and she is kind of the reason we see a lot of the comps at the top that we do, and more specifically Frost, which you'll notice are at the top of the A plus tier here. Valeera is a dominant reason why Frost is such a powerful comp, because not only does Frost have a bunch of individually powerful units, but her speed really breaks some abilities that would otherwise be probably just fine, still good, but not incredibly overpowered, like Varden Cold Snap and Belinda's Elemental, and a bunch of other things, but those are the really most glaring ones. So because of that, no other character really warps the game in the meta like Valeera does on her own by existing with that speed buff and being able to just target stuff down through taunt. She's just crazy. Nothing has changed there, so she is still our only character in S tier. Next up, we do have our A plus tier. So these are, the top of the top for A. I'm going to just read through them all here. We have Localar, Varden, Belinda, Sinestra, Grom, Cookie, Jaina, Malfurion. So the Frost core at the top of the A plus ranks here really should be a surprise to no one. Localar is what happens when you print a counter at Valeera power level, and I think he is just barely below that S tier, but he's really, riding that line pretty hard because Localar, I think, is one of the most degenerate units in the game in terms of scaling. Frost was already good without him, and with him, it's just insane. And it punishes more than just Valeera speedy strategies. It punishes pretty much anything that is 5 speed or slower, which is most of the characters in the game, funnily enough, other than some of the dragons. So yeah, Localar, I think, is just really, really strong. Second best character. And then the other two Frost units right behind him. Varden, just the cold snaps Varden enables are silly. At 2 speed, at 6 speed, they're fine. Speeding him up to 2 with things like Valeera or even Rogers is ridiculous. and that I don't think will be going away from the meta anytime soon. Belinda was really just that green that both the fire comp and the frost comp really needed. Belinda's just crazy, and her ice elemental, water elemental is just so strong on its own. Like, it almost makes it feel like Frost has an extra mercenary just because of how powerful that one little summon is. And again, particularly because it can be sped up by Valeera. So instead of 5 speed, it's going at 3 speed, or the turn after 1 speed, which is pretty ridiculous. So that's why Belinda's up there. Then we have Sinestra. Sinestra is just, even before we got dragons, her self-healing and AoE damage output is nuts. If you do not have a dedicated answer to Sinestra, she'll absolutely roll over you because she can just heal so quickly and for so much, and you get that damage prevention. So she really has demanded a lot of answers, and that's why Thrall is still a popular and high-tier character. Next up, we have Grom. Grom is still really good. I've seen a little bit less of him in the last week or two, but I don't think that's because he's any less powerful. I think people are just experimenting with different stuff, and it's sometimes hard to find a place for him in the Frost build. Though I could see him running him over Rag, maybe. That gets in some of those comps. So Grom, still really, really good. Still shows up, in all the GVT builds, but he hasn't gotten worse. I think he just isn't being as played as much, and I think the reason for that is because the comps that involve Grom haven't changed a whole ton. So people are kind of focusing on some of the newer stuff, but not for any power level reason. I still think he's at the top here. Cookie, I mean, what is there to say about Cookie that hasn't already been said before? The appetizers is nuts. The cookie snipe is great. I mean, all his abilities are just great, and he finds a home in everything. There's not a comp that doesn't benefit from having him if you have the space for it. So pretty unsurprising that he is up here in the higher tier. Jaina, our last member of the Frost comp. I still think Jaina is really, really powerful, and maybe you could argue that she should be a little bit higher up than over maybe Grom or Cookie, but I do think there is a pretty big gap in terms of just how prevalent and individually strong the other 3 Frost mercenaries are. While Jaina is still incredibly strong, I think she's a bit easier to deal with, especially compared to Localar. I think Localar is the most insane of the bunch, as you can tell by it being at the top. But Jaina's still really good. Her ice block can be really annoying, and the fact that her frost scaling scales up all your other frost units, just, it contributes to that critical mass of damage, and it gets out of control pretty fast. So, even if you're trying to play around Varden or play around Localar scaling, Jaina gets him up too, and it just gets pretty silly. So Jaina definitely in the A+ tier, and then the last of the A+ tier here, we do have Malfurion. Malfurion, nature bench, I don't think has gotten much worse. However, because of the new mercenaries and the new comps that have been being tested, I think people have just had less room to slot, nature in as the default backline. However, it is still good in nature dragons, it's still good in GVT, it's still good in a lot of comps. I think much like Grom, it's just fallen out of popularity because people have, seen it for so long. So they want to try something else, but I don't think that means it's any worse. It's still a very, very powerful unit. And the fact that Malf not only speeds you up, but also gives you healing, makes him feel like, just a top tier unit. Then getting down into A tier here, A is still really great. All these are, top tier characters that still see play in a lot of comps. I just think their power level is ever so slightly below the ones in A+. The start of this one has to be Ragnaros, as Rag is kind of our saving grace against a lot of the Frost comps out there right now. Sulfuris is kind of needed to make him not super squishy, because he only has 69 HP otherwise when maxed, whereas 89 is a lot more than that, and shutting off freezing is absolutely huge. I think that's the biggest reason Ragnaros is seeing play right now. So really, it's due to the dominance of Frost, but Rag is also a pretty solid unit overall. Then we have our first of the new units here, a Nefarian. Nefarian's really good. He has 3 really powerful items that can all work well depending on the build that you are running. So it is not a surprise at all to me that he's all the way up here. He's just, he is one of the reasons the multiple dragon comp ends up working, in my opinion, because either you're giving your dragons all this attack, or you're healing when they die, or you can even have his spawns come in with Divine Shield to stick around for longer, that extra attack for more damage. He's just a very individually powerful unit, and he synergizes really well with both the old dragons and the new dragons. And then we have Rogers. Rogers has just been an all-star off the bench. She can be a good lead too, but the fact that you can speed things up. Also, you really do need a powerful blue answer for things like Ragnaros, for things like Localar, for things like Grom and Malfurion, and Rogers just scales up incredibly quickly, and her kit is just great. She has a really strong kit. Haven't seen too much item experimentation with her outside of just the attack scaling. That seems to be the best one. But maybe there are fringe uses for other ones. But Roger is just, I think, one of the best blues right now. And she's unique because she's one of the few blues that can actually physically attack. And I think that that's been rather good for her. And Longjin is probably my favorite design of the new Mercs we've had over the new year. And it's just awesome. Like, it's perfect for dragons. I think its items were really well designed, and the nice thing about its swapping ability is even when you don't use it, it can have an effect on your opponent's game, which is sweet. That's how you know an ability is really powerful, kind of like Localar, where your opponent can kind of mind game themselves by playing around it and make a worse play, and you didn't even do the move. So I think that's really cool, and especially with all the new dragons, Longjin, I think, has had an increase in power because now you can have a mostly dragon-focused comp, and you have dragons that summon other dragons, so it gets even bigger on the bench if you're running that scaling equipment. So Longjin, just absolute all-star, definitely deserving of the A tier. Yu'lon, right up there with her. Yu'lon, just the damage prevention you get with Yu'lon is insane. It's also really powerful in the Dragon Mirrors because you can totally nuke down an enemy green dragon if they make the mistake of attacking on turn 1. So just those things on their own are very powerful. You can scale up some health, scale up your nature damage, shut down Valeera stealth temporarily. Smirk just does a lot, and the biggest thing probably is that passive damage resistance for dragons. It's just very, very powerful. 4 damage doesn't sound like a lot, but the fact that that applies before critical hit damage is factored in is a really big deal and can make it really hard to kill your dragons. Next up, we have one that actually rose up a bit, Vol'jin. So I would say Vol'jin bumped his way up from B tier to A tier because of Kazakis, who is also an A tier here. Kazakis really kind of re-enabled the Shadow strategy somewhat. It was falling out of favor for sure. I think the only builds that really saw Shadow in them in the past, in the last month or so, where you still had 1 or 2 people playing like Shadow Samuro, or some people who were trying it out like Shadow Valeera, but it just didn't feel that great. I don't think it ever put up like that great performance. But now that we have another powerful, fully shadow-based Merc in Kazakis, speeding up those golems, speeding up his damage, it's just good. 1 speed golems, make a big taunt, make some 8/8s with Divine Shield to annoy Valeera, or make some 6/6s that die instantly, scale up your Diablo, scale up your Sylvanas. Really powerful when you're speeding those up by 3. So I think that, and just the general power level of Vol'jin, and his nice AoEs and slow, I think he definitely deserves the A tier spot. Thrall, I debated putting him up in A+, but I think really the reason Thrall has been good has been more so because of Sinestra, and I do think, barring the dragon comps, Sinestra's popularity has gone down a little bit due to people just learning how to pack an answer for the Sinestra. She's still like one of the best characters in the game, but I think that's kind of what is making Thrall up here in A tier, as GVT, while still a powerful comp, has definitely fallen off in terms of popularity. It is not the most popular comp like it once was, and even though it's still decent, I think, Thrall definitely has a place in the meta, but to me, I'm definitely seeing him a lot more as a bench unit, as a kind of precaution against either Sylvanas, which is also in this tier, which we'll get to in a minute, but more so Sinestra. Sinestra's the big one. Just being able to delete a Sinestra is very, very powerful, and I think obviously he's very good if you happen to be running into a lot of that green dragon lead with Voon. Brukan, have him in the A tier here, mainly because I think he's just a bit less independently powerful than Malfurion. On his own, he doesn't really see as much play in many comps, whereas Malfurion sometimes can see play in a few different builds, mainly some stuff with Chi-Ji, which is definitely pretty fringe, since Chi-Ji kind of got nerfed in that bug fix. But Brukan is still really powerful with the chain lightning, the scaling. I mean, between the scaling he enables, the big damage with chain lightning, and the fact that you're usually healing off of it if you have Malfurion out, still a very, very powerful unit. Just, nature backline isn't seeing quite as much play, so I figured put him in the A tier here. Now, a character that has kind of risen up from the ranks since last time has been Sylvanas, and can't really talk about Sylvanas without talking about Kazakis, which is coincidentally right next to her here in A tier. And Kazakis has really enabled the return of Sylvanas because he can just summon more golems and more characters that just immediately die to pump up your Sylvanas in the late game, and it's just so good. Like, this is exactly the kind of unit Sylvanas wanted and needed, and the fact that he's also Shadow, so if your Kazakis gets killed off, you can actually sometimes swap in your Sylvanas after the Vol'jin dies, or not Vol'jin, after the Kazakis dies, and then you get that free speed up, which it's not always relevant for Sylvanas because you usually want to scale her up on the first turn. But afterwards, 1 speed, pretty good instead of 4. And you can apply that shadow resistance or shadow weakness with Vol'jin to make it hit for even more damage. So definitely think Sylvanas is deserving of the A tier now. And another part of that is she kind of also answers Sinestra because she can scale up to such a high number where you can basically just like one-shot Sinestra sometimes. So, and then Kazakis, I mean, his golems are crazy. He can deal pretty decent damage with his skill 1 once you've had a few golems die. The transform into a dragon ability is really cool and can occasionally be powerful, but it definitely kind of hurts taking a turn off, and a lot of times your golems will die before that ability goes off, so it doesn't really gain him that much stats, but if you can find a way to kind of swing it, it can be very powerful, but it's really, the golem ability is what is making Kazakis good, and then the Shadow Claws is kind of good by extension of the golem ability being good. And then last but not least in A tier, we do have Cornelius. So Cornelius, the big reason he's showing up here is he works very well in certain counter comps. Big reason for this is he is one of the few ways next to Ragnaros here that can actually shut down what Frost is trying to do with their speeding up of the Belinda Elemental by blocking it at 2 speed. Also provides some nice sustain to your characters, and his ability to kind of protect a unit for a turn and take all the damage for them is very, very strong, combined with his damage resistance. Definitely very powerful unit, and in the right comp, he can really save you from being basically locked out of the game by freezes. So that's why Cornelius is all the way up here, because really, aside from him and Rag, there aren't a ton of answers to Frost right now, which is why they're kind of at the top of the A+ tier here. Don't get me wrong, Frost isn't unbeatable, but is very, very strong in the meta. And until we see some more either anti-Frost cards or cards that provide similar utility to Cornelius or Rag, I think Frost comp isn't going anywhere. But yeah, Cornelius definitely good because of that. Now we're going to scroll on down here. So B tier, top of B tier, we have Diablo. I really debated putting him in A tier, and he kind of rides that line. Probably could justify him up there as well, but he has fallen off a bit in terms of popularity after the Sinestra launch. Sinestra just kind of solos the Karen Diablo cookie backline, so because of that, Diablo really fell down, but he is, at the top of the tier here for a reason, and that reason is Kazakus, because Kazakus has actually enabled Diablo to come back a bit. Actually has a lead too, which is rather interesting because you can scale up his HP a ton with the Kazakus golems, which is pretty cool. Fun interaction there. You do still occasionally see him on a bench, sometimes with the Tyrion Death Rattle buff. I think that's when he's at his best on the bench, but he's definitely really kind of fallen out of favor. And really the only time I usually see him is in Kazakus builds or the random one-off bench that happens to have him. Karen is in kind of a similar boat where Karen was amazing in the launch of the game, but post Sinestra, he just isn't dealing the damage you want a red to be dealing. You need a more powerful and impactful red, in my opinion. And Karen just isn't it right now. I think he also suffered because of the fall of Diablo, and he was always known for speeding up Diablo to get those nice AoEs, but it's just not as powerful in the current metagame as it used to be. So it's not bad, but I think it deserves a spot up here in B tier. Then we have Eudora. Eudora's been really, really good in a few comps, actually. I tried out a build recently that used her with a bunch of summons and then Sylvanas on the bench. It was pretty cool, felt pretty powerful. The most popular spot I've seen her actually is in a build with Ragnaros, because if you are going to be doing a lot of summons, you do need to be mindful of what your opponent can do to freeze you and lock you out, and Rag stops that. So Eudora is really good in that kind of build, but you do have to be careful if you don't have a way of shutting down the freeze, and Rag is the best way to do that right now with her. Then Tyrion's Death Rattle is still incredibly strong, and he's actually one of the reasons I have the last character in B tier here, Leeroy. The +8/+8 is huge. You just need to make sure you have units that care about attacking, and it should pay off pretty heavily for you. It's also nice because there are a fair amount of attacking units going around right now, so being able to shrink a unit at 2 speed is very strong, and the Blessing of Kings can sometimes take people off guard as well, but you're really just trying to kill Tyrion, so that way you can get that +8/+8, because that is a lot of stats. Then we have Baron Geddon. So the reason Geddon's up here is because the fire comp's actually pretty decent right now. The standard fire opener with Rag, Belinda, and Geddon, and either the fire or the water elemental is pretty strong. It's not strong against everything, but there are definitely builds that really don't appreciate that big Geddon AoE on turn 1 and then turn 2. And that's kind of why it's all the way up here. Like you can counter some comps with the fire comp. So it's actually been a lot better than I think it has been in the past. So that's what gets Geddon up here in B tier. Then this one's really surprising. We had Voon climb all the way up from bottom tier, I believe, last time. And that's because of the Dragon Opener comp. This one has Sinestra, Voon, and Nefarian. And it uses Voon's passive to deal a bunch of damage. Whenever a dragon attacks something, it deals more damage to it. So you can actually turn 1 kill an opposing Varden, which is really, really sweet. And that's even if they freeze one of your guys. Should still be enough, I believe. So it's very, very powerful. Obviously, opening triple green can be a little dangerous as you do open up yourself to being countered sometimes. But the risk can be worth it because it is just a very, very powerful thing to do. And I didn't even realize Voon had a passive like that. So I'm honestly really surprised, but I've seen other people play it, I've tried it myself, and it works. So he gets a spot up here near the end of B tier. And then our last B tier unit here is going to be Leeroy Jenkins. I'll be honest, I really did not think when I read Leeroy's abilities and especially looked at his stats, I did not expect Leeroy to be a very powerful character. I'm a big fan of Leeroy from base Hearthstone. Always liked the Leeroy memes, and he was a fun card to play. But I didn't think he was going to be that good in Mercenaries, and he actually really surprised me. He generates a ton of attack, and particularly after a Tyrion buff or something, getting him in off the bench, you press that 0 speed ability, and you can just totally mess your opponent up. Having the first 0 speed ability in Mercenaries, and it being as good as it is, in terms of just messing up your opponent's game plan potentially by doing random attack orders after he attacks everything, is just great. It's very powerful, especially if you can buff up Leeroy, you can just delete some units. So I do think he is better as a bench mercenary. I have seen a build or two that can kind of work with him as a lead, but generally I believe he's stronger on the bench, but he can still be incredibly powerful and swing games that you might otherwise have no business winning. So for that reason, he is in B tier. So that is our B tier. Next is going to be C tier. This is kind of the last tier I'm really going to focus on. I will show off D and F tier as well, but there are a lot of characters there, and I think, you know, after the last tier list I did, I think people can understand why a lot of these characters are down where they are, and because not a lot changed in terms of the impact of a lot of these characters. So for C tier, we have Deathwing at the top of C tier. I think Deathwing is a good dragon, but they just feel a little bit lackluster, and I really wish their taunt ability was actually fire, because if it was, you might be able to get away with running it in the fire comp as like an enabler, but unfortunately it's not, and their other abilities, though they are fire, are too slow to be comboing with your other fire units, most notably Geddon. So because of that, they don't really have a home in the fire comp, but they can work great in the dragons comp. Specifically, if you're running into Frost, you can open double green dragons and then use Deathwing to protect them from being frozen by the elemental. And if you have the Nefarian attack, the elemental will actually die to the residual damage, and you can kill Varden turn 1 with your green dragons. So that's pretty powerful. I've been trying Deathwing in a bunch of dragon builds, and he feels pretty alright. He's not as crazy as like Nefarian or Longjin or Yulon, but he definitely has a place in some dragon builds. So for that reason, put him in C tier here. Next one is Lich King. Lich King's pretty interesting because he kind of fell out of the meta after being pretty prevalent in the beginning of the game, but he fell out of the meta recently, specifically because of Localar, where permanently slowing your opponent's whole board, now that's kind of a liability. The reason he's actually up here, though, is because of a kind of cool tech with one of his abilities where basically he has a passive like Voon, but his passive says it'll deal 10 damage to an enemy whenever that enemy acts at 7 speed or slower. So this is actually anti-dragon tech, and a cool interaction about this I just learned is this actually scales off of Localar's frost damage. So if your opponent is scaling up that Localar frost damage, they will actually get punished even harder by the Lich King's slow ability, or the passive effect, not the slow ability. But dragons are naturally slow, so it just kind of punishes them for going at 7 speed or slower, and for that reason, it's been pretty strong. You also have that fringe healing available and sometimes the taunt, but I definitely think his main attack and the passive are the reason he is deserving of the spot in C tier, because dragons have become much more prevalent now. Speaking of dragons, we have 2 more here in Onyxia and Alex. I do think these are 2 of the weaker dragons comparatively, but they are not weak characters on their own. I do think Onyxia is a little bit fragile, though, and you do need that max extra 5 HP for her to really realize that true potential, because 65 HP is very, very small. I mean, 70 is not that much better, but it helps. And she's a blue, so she can easily get targeted by the big greens like Valeera that just delete her way too quickly. But if you can find a way to protect Onyxia, or if your opponent doesn't have a way of getting around a taunt or something, you can actually do pretty crazy things with Onyxia. Worth noting, I think her passive is bugged currently. It is supposed to scale off of fire damage, so whenever your friendly dragon dies, you deal 7 to the enemy board. That's supposed to scale off of fire damage. It doesn't seem like it is currently, but hopefully they can fix that. But she definitely can be a good unit, and she's great at really hitting down like a taunt like Cornelius, so you let your other guys through for the turn. But just because of how fragile she is, she hasn't seen like the most play out of all the dragons. But I do think she does have a place in some full dragon or 5 dragon comps. A lot of the same can be applied to Alexstrasza here. Alexstrasza I've tried in place of Deathwing, actually. Sometimes the healing from Alex can be useful, and I've also tried using the ability that speeds up her skill 3 so you can snipe down a big unit that is scaled up. But overall, Alex, does suffer a bit from launch mercenary syndrome, where her abilities they feel fine, but they don't feel as crazy as some of the new Mercs we're getting. Even some of the new dragons, but obviously she does have dragon synergy, and get her middle ability with the AoE if you have another dragon can actually be pretty strong. So for that reason, putting her in C tier, she sees some play in dragon comps, but she's not like core like some of the other dragons. You can definitely get by without her. Next unit we have here is Captain Galvangar. Mainly he's up here because he is a decent way of shutting off Localar sometimes, or other kind of one-button spamming mercs. Shutting something off for 3 turns with his third ability is just super duper strong, and you really can't underestimate how annoying that can be, even against something as simple as like Cookie. Not being able to do damage with his snipe for 3 turns is pretty silly. And he's also good in orcs, so right next to him we actually do have Sourfang, and they're kind of like peas in a pod here. I do think Surjak's orc nature build is still rather strong, and so that's why I kind of have Sourfang up here with Galvangar, because I do think together is really the best way they work. And I don't think other orc comps are that great right now, mainly because of the prevalence of frost, and orcs are just slower, so you are more susceptible to getting beaten down and then snapped, which is unfortunate, but it still works against some of the rest of the field, so they're both chilling in C tier. Illidan, kind of a similar thing. Illidan was showing up a lot in the Frost Tyrion comps in the past, and those kind of disappeared a bit. He still does show up occasionally on the bench, especially in comps that do lead with Tyrion, but he's not as prevalent as he used to be. You almost never see an Illidan lead anymore. But he's not a bad mercenary. I think he still can be powerful, and against the right comp, he can kind of farm them. But again, he's just more fringe and doesn't see a whole lot of play in a lot of the more meta builds. Samuro, it's kind of similar. We talked about Shadow Samuro before, and that has really fallen off. I mean, I don't think it was great before, but it could still steal some wins here and there. Now that dragons exist, I think it's even worse, because he can just get absolutely deleted by Yu'lon on turn 1. So I think, again, individually powerful mercenary, but he just isn't making the cut in a lot of comps, because there's just better or more synergistic units to consider. Then we got 2 beasts and a Rexar here. So, I mean, these all kind of go in a relatively similar category. Beasts haven't been great for a while. They did see play, like a month or so ago. I had a pretty cool beast build, which I think is still fine, where you'd use a beast opener and a dragon backline to scale up your long gen at the end of the game. And I think it can still be good, but the meta has changed a fair bit since then. I mean, Frost is still a very prevalent part of it, but in terms of like the new stuff, I don't really know how well this lines up against the new stuff. It doesn't really have crazy damage, and I think dragons can kind of out-sustain it. So I figured C, kind of middle ground. I bet these units can do well against some stuff, but I think against a lot of the more meta stuff, they're going to struggle with. I do think out of them, though, Nuzao is definitely the most independently powerful and can have some potential, but I don't think many people, myself included, have really experimented with where he finds the best home. So a lot of potential in his power, but I do think we need a bit more testing to see where he really shines. But definitely don't sleep on that 2 cooldown, 10 damage prevention for 2 turns ability. I was trying that a little bit earlier today on stream, and it felt rather strong. And then Rexar, obviously, if they're more better beasts, Rexar will get better. The beasts right now are okay, but I think just if you're looking for a tribe with synergies, Dragons is just doing it better right now. So until we get more beasts, I think he deserves his spot in C tier here. And we have another new mercenary in Drekthar. Drekthar I thought would be stronger than he is. I think he really suffers from his first ability being random. It's cool we got a blue orc finally that does have synergy with other orcs. And I have seen 1 or 2 fringe orc builds, but they just don't feel that crazy to me. Like, I think, even if you do freeze something, the fact that it's random and you can't control it is a pretty big downside. And to be honest, his other 2 abilities are really underwhelming comparatively. So I think he can see fringe play, especially in, maybe a double freeze comp, which I did try out and it felt okay. I just don't think he's that crazy of a mercenary given the current metagame. Then our last unit in C tier here is going to be Natalie. Like I said about Shadow before, Shadow, or the old versions of it, have kind of fallen out of favor. Kazakus has kind of replaced Natalie as Vol'jin's best friend, and I think you really just need to be doing something incredibly powerful if you're going to be leading with 2 blues because of the prevalence of units like Valeera, Belinda, Nefarian. There's just so many good and strong green units that if you don't have a way to kill them quickly, it's really a liability having a double blue open right now. So I think that's part of the reason Natalie has fallen out of favor. But again, independently powerful Merc, good synergy with Shadow and stuff, just the metagame doesn't feel like it's the right place to see her thrive right now. So those are all our, top few tiers here. I'm not going to go super in depth on the bottom tiers. I will talk about a few units though, specifically like one of the new guys here. We do have Vandar Stormpike. Vandar's really cool, and I think there is a bit of potential with him, but the problem is he's really, really bad in a Frost meta, it feels like. He does have an equipment that makes him so he can't be frozen, but the thing is, I find in the builds I've tried with him, you kind of want that ability that gives him taunt and the extra health more. And it's a shame taunt doesn't also give him the can't be frozen. I think that should have been on the same item, to be honest, and then he would have been a lot better. But as it stands, he's not a bad unit. It just feels like he doesn't have a place in many comps, and the only place he has is, like, I tried it in a summon comp, and he felt good there, but it's just such a terrible matchup into Frost because you kind of need your opening red to be Ragnaros to stop the Frost, that as long as Frost is a big part of the meta, I think it's going to be pretty hard for Vandar to see play. Chi-Ji also fell pretty heavily after the bug fix. Chi-Ji's still a really cool unit, and maybe with some more healing synergies or a better taunt or some better way of protecting him, he can come back, but it really hurt having his third ability not scale up more than it was supposed to, because I think that was really enabling a lot of the powerful stuff he was doing. And without it, it's not that great. It feels like Chi-Ji takes too long to get to that point of where scaling is really, really powerful and people can't kill it. And most people have known by now that, Chi-Ji is a big enough of a threat where you just focus it down before it can get out of control. Don't have a whole ton to say about most of the other units here. The ones in D, I think, can see play in more fringe builds. Like, I've seen some Gruuls on ladder as like a pseudo counter to some dragon builds. I think Sneeds can still work in that weird pirate build, kind of, as a way to kill off the elemental from Belinda quickly and deal a bunch of damage. But other than that, Varian can sometimes work as a counter to some things. Blinkfox can be good randomly. But most of these units, I think, have potential. They're not like bad mercenaries. They just don't really feel like they have a home right now. Or the home that they do have, some of them, just doesn't really feel like it has much power against the things that are very prominent in the metagame, like Frost and Dragons. And then F tier, I think the majority of Mercs in F tier here are just pretty much unviable currently in the current, especially in the current metagame, but it just feels like there's no real home for them right now. Obviously that could change, but it just feels like if you're putting most of these Mercs in a comp, you're making the comp a lot worse. Maybe an exception, maybe Gul'dan could be bumped up because sometimes he does okay in Orcs. Or you could say Edwin because he can make Sneeds a little bit viable, but it's really only against one comp. And, maybe the Murlocs can get a bit better. I don't think old Murkai's bad. There's just not enough Murkai or not enough Murloc support. But generally, it feels like most of these Mercs, you're actively making your team worse by adding them to your team. So unless something drastic changes, I don't really see them moving out of the bottom tier here. But that is our whole tier list. A little bit quicker than last time, but still a lot to talk about, a lot to go over. I mean, 77 mercenaries, so not too surprising. But hopefully you enjoyed it. And if this was useful to you, do remember to like and subscribe. But that is going to do it for this tier list. You know, I believe the new patch should be out at the time of this going up, so I will probably try and get another one of these out around the same time, just, you know, near or right before the end of the next patch, once we have a bit more of a understanding of how whatever new stuff we got impacts the metagame. But as of patch 22.6 with Leeroy, all the other dragons and stuff, this is where I'm feeling about Mercenaries tiers. So curious to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments below. But I will catch you guys next time. Peace.